Hello, everybody, and welcome to Community-Based Learning. And thank you for coming. We have an amazing star-studded panel, and in keeping with GSV, we will not do intros, but you can find all the bios. And let's do a quick show of hands before we start. How many educators in the room? Okay. How many startup founders? Okay, good mix. Okay, and then how about learning and development experts at maybe larger organizations? Okay, good. Raise it high, it's good. Okay, and then I'm sure we have many other, but this just helps us gauge some of our responses to your questions. But let's kick it off a little bit. We believe that we're all big believers in community-based learning. And in general, from the experts here, what should be intentional versus organic? And maybe, Jennifer, can I start with you?
Sure. Well, I think that in terms of hard skills, learning and education, it's very hard to do that peer-to-peer. But when it comes to a sense of belonging and relatability, peer-to-peer can be very strong. And those types of communities can really help power people through those hard skills courses. So I think you have to be really intentional on how you set up your programming to make peer-to-peer learning work.
Okay. Prashanth, you probably have a take on this.
Yeah, sure. I think we have several pillars that we have followed while building Stack Overflow over the past decade. But one I think that stands out relative to your question is that building with the community versus for the community. And I think that's important because, especially when you're dealing with very large numbers, like 100 million monthly visitors, by enforcing certain aspects to sort of how you actually curate content and exactly how you do it, there's a balance there that you have to sort of stay on the right side of. Because if you're too forceful about it without actually seeking ongoing input along the way and really helping construct sort of the algorithm or sort of the platform in collaboration with the community, I think that's like really foundational to making sure you're intentional about that. Because very often if you move any side of that story too much to the extreme, I think it could backfire.
Okay, but let's get really tactical. Is there an example that you could share of maybe where moderation was needed, or maybe there was some activism in the community that needed to be dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, there's been plenty of scenarios. The world's a very dynamic place, as we were talking about earlier. Lots happening in general. So luckily for us, compared to even the previous panel that was talking about a lot of subjective content, right? For us, we have the good fortune of actually mostly dealing with objective content. Because we have the world's largest software programming platform and community. So it's either how do you do this on C# or how do you do this on JavaScript, and that's a very specific answer that's either right or wrong. Luckily, versus a social network, which has got a lot of opinion, right? So at a baseline, I think that helps us. But beyond that, despite that, absolutely there are scenarios where, can you actually be truly welcoming of all kinds of users? If let's say you're a junior programmer and you might sort of you're asking sort of a naive question, let's say. I think historically, the rule sets, which are sort of more well-intended to make sure quality is high, can actually sort of be taken to an extreme where people feel it's somewhat of an unfriendly place. So that's where the company comes in to sort of say, how do we actually enforce a set of guidelines so that everybody feels like it's an inclusive place to actually come in, despite your level of expertise, especially in the context of learning and education. So that's one where we have sort of stepped in to sort of say, let's have a place, a staging ground where people can ask friendlier questions, get coaching, get feedback before you actually post it, and before you get sort of overly criticized for a low quality question.
James, do you have a take on curation?
Yeah, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this as well, Prashanth, because in our view, it's extremely difficult to develop organic communities in a public town square, where you have a huge community that's constantly talking to each other and trying to moderate on a content-specific level. Instead, what we try to do is be intentional about who's actually able to contribute in the first place, who's discoverable on the platform. And then for the communities they found, the specific niche intention they're founding that community for. Right? This is the community for single mothers who are dedicated to tech, right? This is a specific niche intention we're trying to build. And then within that, letting the community moderators actually do their job. And so for us, it's been extremely difficult to look at public town squares. Instead, we focus on being intentional as a platform and who's even able to do this in the first place in order to create more controllable problems.
I'd agree with that. Yeah, at Mighty, we've seen thousands of communities succeed and thousands fail. And inevitably, what the ones that fail have in common is they don't have a really specific reason for coming together. They're like, I'm a community for women to grow. And that creates a problem with marketing. Why would I join that out of thousands of other communities for women? But also, it doesn't give anybody a clear idea of how they're going to contribute. So if you add, hey, this is a community for millennial women who are the single earners in their household, and we're going to come together, we're going to share our successes, our challenges, so that we can become financially literate and we can retire early. Boom. Like, I know who that community is for, and I know as a new member what I'm going to show up and how I'm expected to be a part of that community, and that makes a huge difference.
And Neil, you have a very specific community. Does that resonate with you, or would you disagree?
Yeah, I mean, we have an interesting community because it's everyone about the age of 65. And so we have about 5 million seniors on our platform who are creating content for each other, teaching stuff, right? So it's interesting because we monetize through healthcare. We are like the first education company that's reimbursed 100% through healthcare as a benefit. So we have to curate who goes on there, because they could go in and teach something about food or nutrition, and it could be complete BS, right? And so we won't get, so we have to be very intentional on who goes on. But because it's community-driven, we look at, like, how many previous classes have you sat in? Like, what signals are you sending to the community to establish trust before we let you become a creator on the platform? And so we had to evolve over the years where first anyone could teach, but now we are looking at other signals and trust indicators to allow you to even host a session or teach something on the platform, because there's health outcomes at the end of it.
So you raise an interesting question about what is the role of experts in community-based learning. Anyone want to jump in?
So one thought we've had is that when we observe how a privileged elite person learns, it's completely different from the average person. In that a privileged elite person, so let's take a banker, consultant, VC, whatever it is, and you go, how do you learn a new subject? They tell you, oh, I have this friend who's in this area, and I ask them for advice on who to talk to, what I should read, and so on, and then I dive into the content. When you talk to an average person, we're going, I'm Googling, I'm trying to find this course, I'm not sure, and you see this huge volume of information that's not curated, and it's extremely difficult to decipher how you build a path through that. And so when we think about peer-to-peer learning and what experts play a role in there, we think a lot of times it's about people who are similar to you, but a few steps ahead, offering extremely relevant advice that curates the things you need to read, that then makes the content accessible. So that, to us, is the sort of role of experts in peer-to-peer.
Maybe I could, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say I totally agree. And I was going to add to that I think experts are super critical for, let's say, credentialing. So my brother went to medical school. He's an ER doctor. Arguably pretty important to have those credentials to do what he wants to do and teach other people. But his learning has progressed beyond that, fueled by this community of other physicians who are figuring it out, a scary thing to say about a doctor, but it's true, as they go. And so really just to echo you, at Mighty, we see people who are just a half step ahead, and we encourage them to start because there is power in bringing people together in one place to learn from each other, not just in handing down knowledge from on high, especially when we've done that and we've seen these online courses with these expert videos and these PDFs. They have horrible completion rates because people don't know where to go from there.
Yeah, maybe one other point I'd make here is I think we have actually observed SMEs or subject matter experts both in the public platform that we have, which is again accessed by hundreds of millions of people, and plus also within companies as we sell our software as a service product, right? And in either scenario, what we realize is that the world's moving too fast, especially in technology. So I think every developer, software programmer is learning a new language. I think 70% of developers are learning a new software programming language every year, right? So in that context, while every year, we run a survey where we see the most popular languages, and they constantly sort of get refreshed every year because there's so much innovation. So that pace, regular curriculum, et cetera, is just not going to be able to keep up, because the time that it takes to create new course content to actually keep up with that is just going to be mind-boggling. So the only way to solve that problem is to democratize information where everybody's able to learn at least the foundation of each of these new sort of programming languages. And that's why I think the power of the SMEs is very powerful. And we've noticed this for the past decade in our public platform. And now within our companies that we serve, our customers, because of this complete move towards work from home or remote work, et cetera, it is becoming incumbent for companies to figure out who their subject matter expert is sitting in a very different part of the world, contributing to a question that somebody has in the main headquarters, right? But doing that through software and doing that through sort of this kind of shared learning sort of experience. So that's why we constantly say the future of work is really the future of learning, and that's why we believe that.
I don't know if SMEs is going to catch on.
Yes, thank you.
I'd love to speak to that too, but we experimented with, okay, can people graduate from our courses and become technical mentors and right out after they graduate our courses? The answer was no, actually, that you needed more experience in the workforce before you could properly teach somebody else. And so it was something we experimented with, but it really didn't work out for us, and we realized we're just going to have to spend more to do this, because when you're talking about technical fields like data science, cybersecurity, and software, these people have a pretty significant price tag, but they also tend to be the best teachers.
And how do you think about signaling that on your platform? And James, feel free to jump in with your...
Oh, yeah. I was about to jump in there, too, because we've found that the people who have the strongest expertise are often not very good at explaining it to people. And the people who've worked phenomenally well are often quite young, like just a few years ahead. They've kind of just grasped the concepts just enough, but they've simplified it in their minds enough to be able to convey them effectively. And what we're trying to do, and I don't think we've answered, and would love to hear your thoughts on it, is trying to figure out how you predict that earlier. Because today, all we can see is, okay, this person's now succeeded, they have a social audience, whatever, then they can, do a course and get fantastic ratings out of it. But how do we detect those earlier, people who don't necessarily have a social audience, but could perhaps be great teachers?
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the signals we see who will become a great teacher are those that will take the time on their own accord outside of their curriculum and actually do projects on their own. So self-starters, very intrinsically motivated, where they are practicing their craft outside of the courses. Those folks become great teachers.
Okay, let's transition to how do you measure success so that you can improve? And maybe, Jane, you could lead us off?
Yeah, we got a lot of data. So as I mentioned, traditional online courses have such dismal completion rates. And when you think about community-based learning, at Mighty we do cohort-based courses or courses with communities. What we look for and encourage our creators and hosts to look for is how are you making this a habit for your members, for your students? So how often are people coming back? We talk about that stickiness. And then how are your members contributing? This should not be the host or instructor coming in. In many cases, we have to unlearn, have them unlearn that, look, I have my 1,500 hours of professionally produced video. And it's like, that is not going to make you successful in this new model. It's how often are you asking questions? How are you connecting people with their intros? So we look for that daily habit. And that's why so many communities on Mighty are around health and fitness, spirituality, leadership, career. It's because it's places where you're on a journey, you want to get to somewhere, you don't have a defined stopping point necessarily, but what you need along the way is accountability and people who are moving forward with you. And so that's where it comes to that engagement rate, whether it's weekly or monthly, you want people checking in.
Maybe I think in the context of data, we collect a lot of data in terms of metrics, right, to understand the health of the community. And one of the sort of the newer ones we've been looking at beyond, of course, monthly engaged users and monthly active users and all the sort of traditional sort of KPIs. One that we've thought through is knowledge reuse, very specifically. And why is that important for us? Because on Stack Overflow, given the scale, I think we have about 50 million questions and answers. And that's been accessed about 50 billion times since inception of the company, right? And why that is important to us because it gives us a long a long-term sense of learning on the platform that's ultimately going to scale, for the really, really long term, because there's a sort of compounding effect as this virtuous cycle sort of keep reinforcing. One question that's asked in public is being accessed probably by the same person like 10 years later, ironically, and there's a meme going around on that on social media. It's like, oh, I asked the same question I asked 10 years ago, and I found my answer to my own question. So, because this reuse that is happening so much is allowing people to sort of really get unstuck in a way that they don't realize. So again, knowledge reuse for us is how often is the knowledge on our platform being reused by users on the platform, and so it's not uncommon for us to have a question that's been viewed 10 million times and upvoted 25,000 times by a user and has 10,000 answers that have been edited over the past 10 years. That's a very common situation on Stack Overflow.
That's super interesting. So we actually also measure reuse, but in a completely different context. So what we do is something similar to TikTok and Skillshare having a baby, right? So you can discover learning content like a TikTok feed, and then you can dive deeper into Skillshare. And what's interesting there is we took away all the likes and comments. We kept a save button, and we allow users to save different content into collections that they could formulate and repurpose into courses that they could sell. And so what we measure a lot is how much is this unique piece of content being saved and repurposed again and again by different users on the platform, pieced together into different formats and learning tracks for people. And the more it is reused in that way, the more it obviously has reusable value. And the second big piece that we measure a lot is in terms of the velocity of engagement in a community. And so we look at, within a new community for new joiners, what's the number of new connections they've made within the first 7 days. And we found that you have to at least meet something like 2 people that are complete strangers you never met before, once you join a community within the first week, to create the momentum that keeps you in that community. And so those 2 things have mattered a lot to us.
Yeah, there's a web of activity under the surface, and we always encourage our creators to look at their metrics, because they may see a feed that looks kind of quiet, and then they look at the metrics for DMs or chat, and they're like, holy crap. Oh, okay, like people are just chatting under the surface here, so it's really important to think about those connections.
Yeah, we measure something very interesting, which is confidence, because our tagline is everybody is an expert. If you lived for 60 years, you kind of know something more than everybody else.
You haven't met my dad.
So I think our whole idea is we measure how quickly can someone who starts as a learner becomes a creator and hosts a session. And that usually ties to their confidence level in saying, I can do this too, right? And so we measure basically how quickly learners become creators, and we also measure how many people you bring along. So we can track basically a social graph. Are you learning with the community and building your own cohort? And so if we see that, yeah, you've taken 15 topics together, like, are they really your friends who will come and follow you when you create your own session? So we've been trying to measure that as the strength of the community, and the other usual metrics that people track, but those are 2 important ones for our audience.
And I feel since we're fortunate to be together today, do any of you have a perspective on in real life versus online communities, or are you experimenting with hybrid?
Yeah, all our communities are going offline, because like almost every group that is formed, so like we formed, people came together to learn just basics of iPad and technology, right? Because they were using technology for the first time. Now they're going into the California library system, and so all 200 libraries in California offer classes led by learners who started online are now confident enough to go and run classes in the libraries, teaching others how to use their iPhone and iPad. So it's interesting because they lived in the offline world before. They're just learning the skill to go back and take it and share it with others.
That's cool. We support both, in person, especially with events. We see a lot of people now bringing back in-person events in their communities. But I would say I don't think we're ever really going back to just in person, because when you're thinking about these niche down communities, the one I just described about the millennial women with financial independence, it's pretty short-sighted to think that all those women are going to be in one location. And I think over the last 3 years, I hate to think of the positives, but I do think one of the positives is that it has expanded people's mind of a community being virtual and what that can be like, and bringing people together that you would have never had the chance to meet in person. And I think that's really powerful, and I will definitely continue and even ramp up, though there'll still be a place for things like this, I hope.
Coming from experience of having a completely in real life education company for 4 years until COVID, now we're completely online. I see the future of IRL is absolutely luxury. And if you have financing, everybody can have access to that luxury, which we're really excited about. But it is daunting to go back, to think that we would go back to that. But I think the hybrid model is just a slam dunk of giving people some pop-up in real life experiences to see each other eye to eye, really live and breathe together, as opposed to just being on a Zoom screen. I think that it's going to be really powerful. And now that we've gone through COVID, completely acceptable to have the majority of your learning done online.
One of the elements that's really taken off in the past few months for us is live streaming too, because I think it brings that element of like spontaneity in the community where it's not just like a scheduled Zoom, but we have these hosts just, hey, I popped in to the community and went live for 45 minutes and it was like we were all sharing the same space. So I think the way you use technology can make a difference as well.
And we've talked about a lot of the positives. What are some of the limitations of community-based learnings, or some things that you might advise people to guard against or be aware of?
Yeah, maybe to mention the earlier point that I said, building with the community versus for the community. I think that's an important principle because it has a self-limiting sort of factor, right? Because if your traditional companies have customers and you have your employees, and then you've got to basically figure out what customers need, and you build things that your employees you enable them or empower them to do. In this case, with community-based, you've got a very large group, at least for Stack Overflow. We've got customers, the community, which is massive, and then we've got our own people. So in that context, I think it's quite a bit to navigate to make sure that there's a lot of input that's sought when you're actually making sort of fundamental changes. Because as time goes on, and we've been around for 13 years, a lot of things have been programmatized in a way that is like, it's sort of religion in a way, right? It's on there. And it's very hard to change things very dramatically because a lot of the rule sets, the point system, the badges, the upvotes and the downvotes, and all these elements have been sort of solidified and refined over time based on a sort of community-based model. And by introducing something brand new, to use it, I'll use an example. We recently introduced something called articles, which is long-form content, versus what has traditionally been Q&A content that we've had for 13 years. Articles, in the spirit that we launched it, was to say, sometimes companies need to be able to say, here's a policy to do X, Y, Z, or here's a product retrospective on a certain topic, versus asking a question internally. That itself as a concept, when we introduced it in a product in the public community called Collectives, which is an area for companies to have their mini communities on top of Stack Overflow, that took a lot of time to work through with the community to say, this was actually worthwhile to break some of the rules that have been established for the past decade. So I think, the long story short, I think there's a lot of coordination, time and effort that goes into making changes. And while everybody wants to move fast and break things and everything else that is been talked about for a decade now, it's not as simple as that, because especially when the numbers get bigger, the implications get bigger.
Yeah, what we've found is that mostly in communities, you get this very large volume of niche content, but it's very hard to find a bird's eye view of individual subjects with very structured progression to achieve mastery. And the second piece is that it's very difficult to get synthesized, high-quality insight out of it by nature, because there's just so many viewpoints out of it. And so we're trying to solve that by going into community-curated collections, right? How can we get individuals to participate in curating collective collections of content to try to get to that structured progression? But still, it's incredibly difficult given the nature of a more decentralized process.
Yeah, something I think about, I don't know if I'd call it a pitfall, but a concern is, we're in this creator economy, and you see creators talking about burnout and not being able to have a sustainable living. And when I think about course creators who want to participate in community-based learning, so many of them are afraid to charge. They want to give it away for free. They're like, this used to be a Facebook group, and now maybe I'm moving it, but people aren't going to want to pay for this knowledge and learning, and they're putting so much work into it. So I worry about bringing burnout just to a different platform with a different flavor if people aren't willing to say, this is valuable, I'm spending time on this and providing a service, and I'm going to charge for it. And the irony is that we see much higher engagement rates in communities on Mighty that charge because people pay attention to what they pay for. And so when we try to teach that to hosts, I think they understand it, but it's a scary thing to charge for community-based learning when there has been not a negative take on it, but we're used to learning in a different way for the past few decades.
And what have you learned about willingness to pay?
Yeah, great question. People are shocked, but the average price of a paid monthly membership on Mighty is $40. Like, it's not a cup of coffee. And in fact, we tell people, you want to charge something that represents the value of what you're giving. So as I mentioned, a lot of the communities are around health and wellness, or spirituality, mental health. And we always tell creators, think about what somebody would be paying if they weren't getting these results and transformation from your community, if they weren't getting this accountability. Would they be paying for a personal trainer? Would they be paying for a therapist? Would they be paying for a huge stack of self-help books or other online courses that they aren't actually going to read or take? And so that starts to reframe it. But it's definitely more of a challenge, perhaps, for the creators than it is for the members themselves, interestingly.
But it does feel like a race to the bottom, sort of, almost like media, right? Like now it's like, oh my gosh, I got to pay, $6 a month for a New York Times subscription. I'm sure it's more than that. I can't remember, but that, it's like I've got to pay for this great content from The Economist or New York Times or Wall Street Journal, and people are offended by that, right?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, it's a paywall, and I'm like, wait. There's real writers, there's fact checkers, we should be paying for this. And I worry that education is on that same road.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think for us, again, what we find is the people who are really specific and about who they're bringing together, they are bringing that value, and the results speak for themselves. And frankly, we see the members then market the community more than the host ever does, right? They're inviting other people because they're saying, hey, this changed my life. It's the communities where it's a community for women to learn and grow together. It's $40 a month. Yeah, that's not going to compete with your Netflix bill, your New York Times subscription, your DoorDash. Like, you're not going to have a lot of people willing to pay for that.
I mean, the history of Stack, actually the whole premise of the company being founded was actually against a company that actually had a paywall, right, called Experts Exchange back in the day. So it is interesting that this attempt to actually monetize the community, which was at least in our founders' view, sort of foolhardy, because it didn't make a lot of sense to basically have a democratized sort of place for people to share and just really sort of be able to help each other out, especially software developers who in their heart of heart and their DNA, they do have an intention to share, right? And me as a former software developer, I can empathize with writing code, which is an extremely frustrating experience. So to not only have that extremely frustrating experience, but also to put a paywall when you need an answer right then and right there when you're trying to debug code is absolutely, I think could be extremely frustrating for folks. So that's why the history has always been free. That's why we were up to 50 million questions and answers on the foundation of the platform. But then there was a deliberate attempt to create a business model where you, of course, have a sustainable business. So that's where we have our private version of our public platform called Stack Overflow for Teams, which we charge companies to use internally, the same sort of knowledge-sharing platform. And of course, we have an advertising model as well. So.
Yeah, let me be clear. I mean, definitely there is a place for free communities, of which Stack is a great example. Another one I think of is Yoga with Adriene has her Find What Feels Good Kula community on Mighty, and that's over 200,000 people, and it's a free community, and she monetizes in other ways. I think where I think about monetization as potentially a lost opportunity is for the individual creators who are not looking to crowdsource a ton of answers, but really have some experience they want to bring people together around that is real work. And I just feel like that gets missed more often than it does.
And Neil, do you want to comment a little bit about, you said you're monetizing with healthcare. Can you talk about how did you discover that, and how has that played out for you?
I mean, let's just keep it free to the end user, because at least for our cohort of the community, staying mentally active, physically active, and socially connected reduces the cost of care. And so that was proven in the offline world. We just took it online and scaled it, so we've become a reimbursable health benefit, just like continuous learning. So that allows us to get community members to create, because we have not created any single piece of content on the platform. We started with 5 things with basic tech at the beginning of the pandemic, and now we have 4,500 live sessions running every day globally, all community generated. I can tell you half of it is like, I wouldn't take a class on that topic, but
you heard it here.
but I think the point is, like, because it's helping somebody else get to an outcome they desire, people like it. They're showing up, they're spending 8 hours a day on the platform, just like TV, because this is the only cohort that potentially has a lot more time to spend. And they're curious. I mean, so because they're coming here for curiosity, not for an outcome to get a job or get, a certificate, like the community-based model allows us to do it. And healthcare just proved to be an interesting model where we don't have to go to advertisers to build this community, and we just have shown the outcome is positive.
And can you clarify a little bit, just because others might have this question? Do you have to validate ROI to them, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so we basically looked at what are social determinants of health. That's relevant when you're 5 years old or when you're 90 years old, which is, these are 4 or 5 indicators that were developed, and we just are very intentional that all the content and that is created by the community fits into these buckets. And if generally it doesn't fit into this bucket, we kind of, put it down or make it private. Because it falls into these buckets, it allows us to show engagement. We do assessments like how are you feeling. Loneliness is like a very big it's like a $6 billion industry. And so we ask people like, before getting into a class on food, like, were you feeling less lonely? Have you made new friends? So we do a lot of collection of data that justifies the ROI.
And were those partners helpful in growing your audience too, or are you mainly responsible for growing the community?
We just grew the community. I think the content was unique enough because no one had targeted this audience. So when they saw someone like them create content, it was enough to show up to partners with a lot more users than the partners can. They do try to bring it, but it doesn't, they're not really good at it. They're not good marketers. So.
And to that point, any tips that anyone wants to share for engagement, what you've learned about engaging communities?
Ask questions, polls and questions, even just an icebreaker question, and do introductions. Those are the 2 notifications that Mighty Networks communities get that bring back the most people, have the highest open rates, have the highest engagement rates. And the other thing about questions, if you have them built into the platform, they're easy to answer. You can answer them with your thumb, right, if it's a multiple choice. And then we see this cascade of interactions in the comments. And so it's really simple, but if you teach somebody how to ask a great question, their community is going to be a lot more successful.
Yeah, perhaps also for Stack, we've noticed that over the years, we have a power user group called the Meta community, which I think has been a very, very huge benefit for us to get very close to understanding with a sort of very credible group of people how the broader population of the community thinks. Because you can't engage with 100 million people, right, for engagement every time. So the question is, you need a representative sample, no different from other entities that are out there. So that is, I think, has been a true mechanism for us to get feedback very rapidly. We've got moderator forums. We've got, we do AMAs on the Meta community. We post about upcoming things that we're planning on doing in that group. Again, accessible by all, but definitely directed to that group so they can give us early feedback. So then we know, when we actually launch it for the broader community, what it's going to receive. So that's another sort of hack I think is useful, to work with a power user group that represents a broader group.
And are those people compensated?
Not in a traditional monetary sense, but of course, all of Stack is, there's a lot of pride in sharing what's in your mind. And so a lot of the compensation, quote unquote, is through being recognized as the world's leading, JavaScript programmer, right? And that person is going to be absolutely, well known in the Stack Overflow community as having, 1 million points. People know our top users on Stack, right? They literally know their names because they are, if they are public, that is, but at the same time, they are legends in the context of them having helped so many people. Because if you help 10 million people with the same question, you're certainly more than just, a friend. So.
Yeah, I find this super interesting because this is one of the strongest arguments, I think, against tokenized communities. We had a long discussion about whether we should give financial incentives via tokens for people contributing. And one of the communities we recently created for impact entrepreneurs, we had this discussion exactly. And people were like, no. Like, my whole intention is to give back. Like, I want to show that this is not about money, and it actually increases engagement as a result. And so it's super interesting. For us, it's extremely similar. It's basically 3 three things. One, make 1 to 2 introductions per person in the community within the first week after they join. Second, find the community activists early and devolve power to them so that they could start driving the community themselves. And three, being extremely intentional about the niche audience that this community serves, and regardless whether it's paid or not, keeping it a gated community so that it drives people with like-minded nature, like-minded understanding to boost engagement because of that common understanding. So that's been the most important stuff for us.
I think that's so smart to keep some friction into entering, because if you have a free community, you just run the risk of so many trolls. And even if you just have a single question at the outset of, why are you in this community, you just get a much more refined participant base.
Mm-hmm. We pay everyone in the community. We'll because I think, again, of ageism, nobody's hiring people in this cohort. So for us, we use the community members we reskill them and say, you're in support, you're a moderator, you're an instructor, and we've found a way to reimburse them enough. And so I don't know how long that will continue. It's been only 2 years, but it feels like there's enough money out there for our community to live happy, healthy, engaged lives that we can afford to pay everybody on the platform.
It's amazing. That's better than free. I don't. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left. So let's do a lightning round with a prediction for the future. We can do popcorn style. We won't.
Me first? Okay.
Sure. Okay.
Mentors, not managers. I think the corporate workforce is going to lean in to mentors that have a keen interest in supporting and upskilling the employees, and that there's going to be compensation tied to what is your network effect within a company. So I think mentors is the future.
And can I clarify a question? Mentors within your organization or without or both?
Within.
Okay.
Within.
Okay.
I'm shocked that I'm not going to say something about Web3, but I've been thinking about this a lot.
You can say two things.
No, I'll stick with my one. But, I've been thinking a lot about AI, and I think we're going to hear a ton about AI, even more so than we hear today in the future. It's going to be the way you learn. You're going to have this thing somewhere, and it's going to interpret the world for you. It's going to help you. It's going to coach you. But I actually think what's going to be more revolutionary is software that's going to be able to connect you to relevant people at relevant times who can get you where you want to go. And personally, that's the world I would rather live in. So maybe I'm trying to, push things that way with my prediction.
You're projecting.
Self-fulfilling prediction.
You should check out our For You feature on Stack Overflow for Teams. It does exactly what you're talking about.
As a marketer, I don't spend enough time on Stack Overflow.
That's true. So our prediction, I think, would be, because I think there are about 70,000 technical software developer jobs out there, right, at this point in time. And that is not going to dissipate anytime soon. We're about to sort of go into the tsunami of a wave where every company is looking to digitize, and there's just going to be, the supply is not going to be able to keep up with the demand, right? So with that comes this need, in our opinion, to have the reskilling, upskilling conversation within organizations to say you have to work with people that you already have, that have a foundation of knowledge, and I think that's the only way to get out of that. That sort of unfortunate sort of trench. And in our opinion, that's why the future of work is the future of learning, because I think you have to think about the upskilling and reskilling.
Yeah, to us, content is going to be fully commoditized, as it's going to race to the bottom and become almost fully free. And instead, when you look at lifelong learning, it's going to look like a very large number of dense communities of like-minded people recommended to each other mostly by personalized algorithms, learning and building with each other every day.
Yeah, I just think online communities are going to become stronger with in-person stuff. So I think this 2 years of the wave that we saw, we need offline communities, and that's where I think the stickiness is going to come from. So I think the future is still a hybrid of offline and online.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking the panelists, and really thanks for coming.
Thanks, Anne.